The September fog rolled through Portland's West Hills like a living thing, wrapping itself around the Douglas firs and settling into the valleys where modest ranch homes lined the quiet streets. Evelyn Marks stood at her classroom window, watching the mist blur the edges of Lincoln High School's parking lot. Her coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she continued to clutch the ceramic mug, finding comfort in its familiar weight. The morning bell wouldn't ring for another 15 minutes, and these stolen moments of solitude had become essential to her daily ritual. At 37, Evelyn had taught English at Lincoln for 12 years, long enough to see the subtle shifts in teenage culture. The way grunge had swept through the hallways like wildfire, replacing the polished pop sensibilities of the late 80s. She understood these kids, or at least she thought she did. They wore their angst like armor, their flannel shirts and torn jeans, a uniform of calculated indifference. But Alex Rayner was different. She'd first noticed him 3 weeks into the semester, not because he stood out, but because he seemed to actively resist standing out. While other students clustered in groups, sharing Walkmans and arguing about whether Pearl Jam had sold out, Alex sat alone, always in the third row by the window, his notebook filled with intricate drawings rather than notes. His essays, when he bothered to turn them in, revealed a sharp intelligence trapped beneath layers of carefully constructed apathy. The classroom door creaked open, pulling Evelyn from her thoughts. Alex stood in the doorway, his dark hair falling across his eyes, his army surplus jacket hanging loose on his thin frame. He was early, which was unusual. More unusual still was the bruise blooming purple and yellow along his left cheekbone. "Morning, Alex," Evelyn said, setting down her mug and moving toward her desk. "You're here early." He shrugged, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his default response to most questions. But today, something flickered in his eyes, a desperation quickly masked. He moved to his usual seat, dropping his backpack with more force than necessary. "Rough night?" she ventured, knowing she was walking a fine line. Teachers were supposed to notice, but not pry, report, but not engage. The administration had made that clear during the mandatory training sessions about recognizing signs of abuse. "My dad's moving out," Alex said suddenly, his voice flat. "Again, third time this year." Mom threw a plate at him. Missed, obviously. He gestured vaguely at his face. Evelyn felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced 20 years ago when her own father's rages had filled their small apartment in southeast Portland. She understood the careful choreography of domestic violence, the way you learned to read the air in a room, to gauge the barometric pressure of impending storms. "I'm sorry, Alex. That must be difficult." He laughed, a sharp sound devoid of humor. "Difficult? Yeah, that's one word for it." He pulled out his notebook, the one filled with his drawings. "You know what's funny? Everyone thinks the 90s are so different, so progressive. We've got the internet coming, Clinton talking about building bridges to the future, but behind all those perfect suburban doors, it's the same old violence, just with better soundproofing." Students began filtering into the classroom, their chatter filling the space. Evelyn wanted to say more, to offer some comfort or wisdom, but the moment had passed. She watched Alex retreat into himself, his pen moving across paper in violent strokes. The lesson that day was on Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, about the corruption beneath the American dream's glittering surface. As Evelyn discussed Gatsby's desperate pursuit of an impossible past, she caught Alex's eyes several times. He wasn't taking notes, but she could tell he was listening, absorbing every word about facades and the price of maintaining them. After class, as students rushed toward lunch, Alex lingered. He approached her desk slowly, his movements deliberate. "Ms. Marks," he began, then stopped, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Do you ever feel like you're drowning in broad daylight? Like everyone around you is breathing just fine, but you can't seem to get enough air?" The question hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She saw herself at 17, standing in her guidance counselor's office, trying to articulate the same suffocating sensation while her mother waited in the car, oblivious to her daughter's silent screams for help. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know exactly what that feels like." Alex studied her face, searching for something. "What did you do? How did you make it stop?" Evelyn chose her words carefully. "I found people who understood. I learned that the feeling wasn't permanent, even when it seemed like it would never end. And I discovered that sometimes talking about the drowning feeling makes it a little easier to breathe." He nodded slowly, processing this. "My mum wants me to see someone, a therapist, says I'm too angry, too withdrawn. But talking to some stranger about my problems seems pointless. They don't know me. They don't know what it's like." "Sometimes strangers can see things more clearly because they're not caught up in the daily chaos," Evelyn offered. "But I understand the resistance. It took me years to accept help." The lunch bell rang, its harsh sound breaking the moment. Alex gathered his things, pausing at the door. "Thanks, Ms. Marks, for listening. Most adults just want to fix everything or pretend nothing's wrong." As he disappeared into the crowded hallway, Evelyn sat back in her chair, a sense of unease settling over her. She recognized something in Alex that frightened her, a darkness she'd spent years learning to manage in herself. The fog outside had thickened, obscuring the world beyond the window, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like pressure before a storm. That afternoon, she would call James Mitchell, the school counselor, and express her concerns about Alex. James would make a note in his file, one of dozens about troubled students. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time anyone took serious action, it would be too late. The murder that would shock Portland and inspire Hollywood was already taking shape in the gaps between what adults saw and what they chose to acknowledge, in the silence between Alex's cries for help and the world's delayed response. October arrived with unusual warmth, what locals called an Indian summer, though the morning fog still clung to the Columbia River Gorge like a secret. Evelyn had started arriving at school even earlier, finding excuses to be in her classroom when Alex showed up. Their morning conversations had become a ritual, careful exchanges that danced around deeper truths while revealing just enough to maintain connection. It had been 3 weeks since their first real conversation, and Evelyn had watched Alex's demeanor shift subtly. Some days he seemed lighter, almost hopeful, showing her sketches he'd worked on, dark but beautifully detailed drawings of Portland's bridges and abandoned buildings. Other days, he arrived wound so tight she could practically feel the tension radiating from him, his jaw clenched and eyes hollow. On this particular Thursday morning, Alex didn't show up early. He didn't show up at all. Evelyn taught her classes with half her attention, her eyes constantly drifting to his empty seat. She told herself he was simply sick, or perhaps dealing with another family crisis. But something felt different. The air in the classroom seemed charged, expectant. During her lunch break, she walked to the administration office, hoping to find some information. The secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, barely looked up from her computer. "Alex Rayner," Evelyn said. "He wasn't in class today. Has anyone called about him?" Mrs. Rodriguez typed something, squinting at the screen through her bifocals. "No call from home. Want me to ring them?" "Please." Evelyn waited as the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Mrs. Rodriguez was about to hang up when someone answered. Even from across the desk, Evelyn could hear the slurred voice, angry and incoherent. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression tightened as she professionally navigated the brief, hostile conversation. "His mother says he left for school this morning," she reported after hanging up. Though between you and me, she didn't sound entirely certain about what day it was. Evelyn's unease deepened. She thought about Alex's recent drawings, particularly one he'd shown her last week, a self-portrait where his face was obscured by shadows, only his eyes visible, staring out with an intensity that had made her shiver. That afternoon, she drove through Portland's southeast neighborhoods instead of going straight home. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, perhaps just hoping to spot Alex at one of the coffee shops or record stores that lined Hawthorne Boulevard. The area was changing, gentrification creeping in like morning fog, pushing out the working-class families who'd lived there for generations. Alex had written about it in one of his essays, about feeling displaced in his own neighborhood, watching as familiar faces disappeared and strangers took their place. She found herself parking near Mount Tabor Park, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The extinct volcano that formed the park's foundation had always been one of Portland's peculiar features, a reminder that even in this seemingly stable city, violent forces lay dormant beneath the surface. Walking the winding paths, she spotted a figure sitting on a bench overlooking the reservoir. Even from a distance, she recognized Alex's hunched posture, the way he held his shoulders as if bracing against an invisible wind. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Mind if I sit?" He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before settling into resignation. "It's a free country. That's what they keep telling us anyway." Up close, she could see he'd been crying, though his eyes were dry now, staring out at the water with unsettling emptiness. His backpack sat beside him, stuffed fuller than usual. "You missed class today," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I couldn't do it," he replied. "Couldn't sit in that room and pretend everything's normal. Couldn't listen to everyone talk about their college plans and their weekend parties like any of it matters." "What would matter?" Evelyn asked. Alex was quiet for a long moment. Truth, honesty, someone actually seeing what's happening instead of just looking through it. He turned to her. "You know what my dad said when he left this morning? He said I was the reason he kept leaving. That my anger, my difficult personality, made it impossible for him to stay, like I'm some kind of poison." Evelyn felt her heart crack. She remembered her own mother saying similar things, how her sensitivity, her neediness had driven her father to drink, to rage, to leave. "Your father's inability to handle his own life isn't your fault, Alex. Adults who blame children for their failures are just trying to avoid responsibility. Maybe, or maybe some people really are poison. Maybe some of us are just born wrong and everyone can sense it." The despair in his voice was so complete that Evelyn felt panic rising in her chest. This was beyond what she could handle, beyond the careful boundaries she'd maintained. "Alex, I think you should talk to someone, a professional. This kind of pain, it's too heavy to carry alone." He laughed bitterly. "Right, so they can put me on Prozac like half the kids at school, numb me into compliance, make me easier to manage. No. So you can learn tools to cope with these feelings, so you can understand that the voice telling you you're poison is lying." Alex stood abruptly, grabbing his backpack. "I need to go." "Where?" "I don't know. Somewhere. Anywhere that isn't here." He paused, looking back at her. "You've been kind to me, Ms. Marks. Kinder than I deserved. Remember that, okay? Whatever happens, remember that I knew you tried." The words sent ice through Evelyn's veins. "Alex, wait!" But he was already walking away, moving with purpose down the path. She wanted to follow, to grab him and shake him until he explained what he meant. Instead, she sat frozen on the bench, watching until he disappeared into the tree line. That evening, she called James Mitchell at home, breaking protocol. She explained the conversation, the packed backpack, the finality in Alex's voice. James promised to look into it, first thing in the morning, to contact the family, and possibly involve the authorities if necessary. But morning would bring its own revelations. The knock on Evelyn's door at 6 a.m., the two detectives with their careful questions and grave expressions. Alex hadn't gone home. His mother had been found dead in their apartment, and Alex was nowhere to be found. The investigation that followed would reveal layers of family dysfunction, systemic failures, and missed opportunities that would haunt everyone involved. The news vans arrived before the full scope of the tragedy was even clear. By noon, Portland's quiet suburban narrative had been shattered, replaced by breathless reporters speaking in urgent tones about the shocking murder that has rocked this peaceful community. Evelyn watched from her living room window as a reporter positioned herself with Mount Tabor visible in the background, the same path where she'd last seen Alex, now part of a crime scene narrative being broadcast across the Pacific Northwest. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at Evelyn's house at 2 p.m., her demeanor professional but tinged with exhaustion. She'd been working the case since dawn, and the circles under her eyes suggested this wasn't her first homicide involving juveniles. "Ms. Marks, I understand you were close with Alex Rayner," Detective Chen began, settling into Evelyn's worn leather armchair. The living room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. "He was my student. We talked sometimes." Evelyn heard how inadequate the words sounded, how they failed to capture the weight of those morning conversations, the shared understanding that had developed between them. "According to our records, you called the school counselor last night, expressing concern about Alex's state of mind." "Yes, I saw him at Mount Tabor Park yesterday afternoon. He seemed desperate, different from his usual demeanor. He had his backpack packed full, and the way he talked it felt like he was saying goodbye." Detective Chen made notes in a small pad, her handwriting neat and precise. "Can you tell me exactly what he said?" Evelyn recounted the conversation, each word feeling heavier in hindsight. The detective's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her posture when Evelyn mentioned Alex's comment about being poison. The mother, Linda Rayner, was found with blunt force trauma. The medical examiner estimates time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight. Alex's father, Robert, claims he was at a motel in Gresham, which we've verified. "Do you know of anyone else who might have had issues with the family?" Evelyn shook her head, then paused. "Alex mentioned his mother threw a plate at him a few weeks ago. He had a bruise. But I don't think he wouldn't." "We're not drawing conclusions yet," Detective Chen said carefully. "We're just trying to understand the full picture. What can you tell me about Alex's mental state in recent weeks?" Evelyn found herself walking a careful line, wanting to help, but also feeling protective of the boy who'd trusted her with his pain. She described his isolation, his intelligence, the darkness in his artwork, but also his sensitivity, his awareness of injustice, his desperate desire to be understood. "He wasn't a violent kid," she insisted. "Angry, yes, hurt, definitely, but not violent." Detective Chen nodded, though her expression suggested she'd heard similar defenses before. "We've found some of his notebooks in his room. The drawings are disturbing. Lots of violence, death imagery. There's also what appears to be a manifesto of sorts, pages about society's failures, about feeling trapped." Evelyn's stomach turned. She thought of the drawings Alex had shown her, dark but artistic. Had she missed something more sinister? Had her own identification with his pain blinded her to warning signs? After the detective left, Evelyn couldn't stay in her house. She drove aimlessly through Portland's streets, past the coffee shops and bookstores, the parks and bridges that defined the city. Eventually, she found herself at Powell's Books, seeking comfort in the familiar maze of shelves. But even surrounded by thousands of stories, she couldn't escape the one unfolding in real time. The evening news revealed more details. Linda Rayner had been struggling with alcoholism for years. Neighbors reported frequent arguments, police calls that resulted in no arrests. The system had failed this family repeatedly, each intervention too little, too late. Social services had a file on the family dating back 5 years, but budget cuts and overwhelming caseloads meant follow-up had been minimal. Evelyn's phone rang constantly, colleagues checking in, reporters who'd somehow gotten her number. She let them all go to the answering machine. But when James Mitchell called, she picked up. "I should have done more," he said without preamble. His voice was rough, strained. "You warned me, and I said I'd handle it in the morning. If I'd called the police last night, we don't know if it would have changed anything," Evelyn replied, though the same thought had been torturing her for hours. "The media is going to crucify us. The school, the counseling department, they're already asking why no one saw this coming, why no one intervened." Evelyn thought about all the times she'd wanted to do more, held back by professional boundaries, by the fear of overstepping, by the system that demanded documentation and protocol over human connection. How many other Alex Rayners were out there, sending signals that got lost in the bureaucratic noise? That night, unable to sleep, she pulled out her own high school journals, pages filled with the same rage and despair she'd heard in Alex's voice. The difference was that she'd had one teacher, Mr. Peterson, who'd seen past her defenses and refused to give up. He'd pushed her toward college, toward a future she couldn't imagine for herself. She'd become a teacher because of him, believing she could be that person for someone else. But she'd failed Alex when he needed her most. The search for Alex continued through the night. Police checked bus stations, youth shelters, all the places a 17-year-old might run. But Portland was surrounded by wilderness, by forests that could swallow a person whole. If Alex didn't want to be found, the city offered plenty of places to disappear. As dawn broke over the Willamette River, Evelyn stood at her classroom window again, looking out at the empty parking lot. In a few hours, students would arrive, full of questions and theories about their missing classmate. She would have to face them to provide some kind of stability in the chaos. But how could she teach them about literature's great themes, about human nature and redemption, when real life had proven so much darker than any fiction they'd read? The fog was lifting, revealing a city forever changed by the night's events. Somewhere out there, Alex was running or hiding or worse. And Evelyn was left with the terrible knowledge that seeing someone drowning and reaching out your hand wasn't always enough to save them. 3 days after Linda Rayner's murder, Alex's body was found by hikers in Forest Park, Portland's urban wilderness that stretched for miles along the Tualatin Mountains. He'd taken an overdose of his mother's prescription pills, leaving behind a notebook filled with his final thoughts. The medical examiner determined he'd died within hours of his mother, though the exact sequence of events that night would remain forever unclear. Evelyn sat in the police station, reading the pages Detective Chen had permitted her to see. Alex's handwriting, usually so precise in his essays, had devolved into desperate scrawls. He wrote about the fight that night, how his mother had been drunk again, how she'd blamed him for his father leaving, for ruining her life. He wrote about pushing her, just trying to get past her to leave, and how she'd fallen, hitting her head on the corner of the coffee table. He wrote about trying to wake her up, about the blood that wouldn't stop flowing, about knowing that no one would believe it was an accident. But most of all, he wrote about the unbearable weight of existing in a world that seemed designed to crush the vulnerable. His words were philosophical and raw, switching between profound insights about societal failures and the desperate pleas of a child who'd never received the help he needed. He mentioned Evelyn several times, thanking her for seeing him as human, for trying to understand. He insisted she shouldn't blame herself, that some people were simply too broken to be fixed. The funeral was held on a typically grey Portland morning, rain falling steadily as a small group gathered at Riverview Cemetery. The media had been barred, but Evelyn could see news vans parked just outside the gates. The story had exploded nationally, with cable news debates about teenage violence, parental responsibility, and the failure of social systems. Everyone had an opinion about Alex and Linda Rayner, though few had known them as anything more than headlines. Robert Rayner stood alone at the graveside, his face a mask of guilt and confusion. He'd been cleared of any involvement in the deaths, but Evelyn could see the weight of culpability in his posture. After the service, he approached her. "He talked about you," Robert said, his voice hoarse. "In the good moments, when he'd come to visit me, he'd mention his English teacher who actually listened. I should have listened more, should have stayed, fought for him, instead of always leaving." Evelyn didn't offer empty comfort. They stood together in the rain, two adults who'd failed a child in different ways, bound now by shared grief and regret. In the weeks that followed, Lincoln High brought in grief counselors and held assemblies about mental health awareness. The students who'd ignored Alex in life now claimed to have been his friend, posting memories on early social media platforms that ranged from genuine to completely fabricated. His desk remained empty for the rest of the semester, a ghost in the third row that Evelyn couldn't bring herself to fill. She found herself studying his drawings more carefully, seeing things she'd missed before. In one sketch of Portland's skyline, he'd hidden tiny figures falling from buildings, so small you'd miss them unless you looked closely. In another, a self-portrait she'd thought showed strength. She now saw the fractures he'd carefully drawn into his own face, like a mirror about to shatter. The media coverage continued for weeks, each outlet spinning the story to fit their narrative. Some painted Alex as a victim of a broken system, others as a troubled teen who'd snapped. The nuanced truth, the complicated reality of a boy struggling with mental illness in a family destroyed by addiction and abandonment, got lost in the sensationalism. Producers from Los Angeles started calling, interested in the dramatic potential of the story. Evelyn refused all interviews, but others were less reluctant to share their versions of events. 5 months later, Evelyn submitted her resignation from Lincoln High. She couldn't walk those hallways without seeing Alex at every turn, couldn't teach The Catcher in the Rye without thinking of his essay comparing himself to Holden Caulfield's desperate search for authenticity in a phony world. She took a job at a community college, teaching GED classes to adults trying to rebuild their lives. It felt like penance, or perhaps just a way to avoid the ghosts that haunted her former classroom. On the first anniversary of the deaths, she visited both graves. Someone had left a paperback copy of The Great Gatsby on Alex's headstone, pages warped by rain. Linda's grave was unmarked, except for a small bouquet of grocery store flowers, probably from Robert. Evelyn placed her own flowers, purple irises that had been growing wild in her backyard, between the two plots. Standing there, she thought about the film producers who'd finally gotten their movie made, a thriller that took the bare bones of the tragedy and transformed it into something slick and consumable. The teenage character was more obviously disturbed, the mother more clearly abusive, the teacher a heroic figure who'd tried everything to save him. It would gross $40 million and win awards for its unflinching look at American dysfunction. But the real story was messier, more painful, and ultimately more human. It was about a boy who'd needed help that never came in time, a mother whose own demons consumed her and her son, and a teacher who'd seen the warning signs but hadn't known how to bridge the gap between recognition and action. It was about a system designed with good intentions but hollowed out by underfunding and overwhelm. It was about the way America, even in a progressive city like Portland, still struggled to address mental illness, addiction, and family violence with anything more than after-the-fact hand-wringing. Years later, Evelyn would occasionally Google Alex's name, finding true crime forums where strangers debated the details of that October night. Some claimed he was a cold-blooded killer, others insisted he was a victim of circumstance. None of them had known the boy who'd drawn butterflies in the margins of his essays about death, who'd quoted Sylvia Plath and Kurt Cobain with equal reverence, who'd asked her once if she thought people could change their fundamental nature or if they were doomed to repeat their parents' mistakes. The fog still rolled through Portland's hills each morning, and somewhere in the city, other Alex Rayners sat in other classrooms, sending out signals that might or might not be recognized in time. Evelyn had learned that sometimes the most profound tragedies weren't about evil or insanity, but about the accumulation of small failures, missed connections, and a society that still struggled to catch its most vulnerable members before they fell. The real murder that inspired a box office hit wasn't just about one night of violence. It was about all the nights that led up to it, all the systemic failures that made it possible, and all the lives forever changed by the collision of pain, circumstance, and tragic timing. In the end, the truth that Alex had desperately sought remained elusive, buried beneath headlines, movie adaptations, and the simplified narratives we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless loss.